And now, Mr. Regal, it is time to talk about some Japanese wrestling. And
Oh,
I want to start out with a question I've always had. You know,
3 inches, but you can have the lot.
the whole thing. I get the whole thing.
Right.
That's amazing. That's
That's just a bit of blue there, just
yeah.
for the few people that listen that like a bit of blue.
And I know that,
Yes.
it's funny. People who've heard me on podcasts know I curse a lot. And I know that, but
No,
we
you
just
won't
like
have none
keeping
of
it
that
classy
with
on
me.
the show. We like keeping it
Yes.
classy. So a blue, that way the blue means more. The less you do it, the funnier it is because,
Yeah.
we don't do it all the time. But
No.
here's a question I always had about wrestling. I've been a fan since 40 years, 40 plus years. And if you're in a ring with somebody of a different language, you guys, and I know you're saying there's experience and you can feel it and all this, but how do you do these things like Irish whips and drop downs and these moves that this one wrestler does every match, but when to get it in? How do you communicate with a wrestler of a different language that you've never wrestled before, or maybe never had a chance to communicate with them? Do you have to communicate, or is it just
So an honest answer is it depends on what time you came into the wrestling industry. With me, I don't have to communicate with it. I know the universal language of wrestling. That's no knock on anybody that come into this from the 90s onwards, because from the 90s onwards, there wasn't the territories, there wasn't unless you went to a certain place or a certain school. I come into this in a very different time. And so there was certain things that you didn't need to know. You didn't have to be able to communicate. You could just wrestle or do pro wrestling. And so just people's body motion or certain things that happened in the previous few seconds, you knew how to react to that person. As time went on, you need to communicate more. If you are in Japan, usually there was at least one person who could communicate between the opponents. When I was going to Japan, I would say 90% or more percent time, the villains and the good guys were in separate dressing rooms. So there may be a referee there was referees that spoke English that would go backwards and forwards between the dressing rooms and when I say give, it's like the smallest amount of communication, so that if you knew at a certain point that you would do this, it wasn't as laid out as things become. And that's no knock at I know there's people that I'm not. It's just different now, and I understand that, and I get it's not back in my day. It's just the way it was. I could do things, and I knew that, or it didn't matter if I did something and they didn't react the way I wanted it. I'd just do something else. Does that make sense?
absolutely?
If I head made somebody or snap made them, as Americans call it, and they didn't come up off the floor, I wouldn't bother going back. I wouldn't back myself into the ropes to use the ropes as a catapult to knock them down. I'd do something else. So
it's just an extension of the tradition of the communication that takes place in the
yes, it's an wrestling years ago, and when I started, was more of an ad lib thing. But you all understood certain things that you could just do, and there was certain bits of it that you just knew how to react to each other. As the time went on, and the less people worked in so many different places, or things weren't and I don't want this to sound like a knock on anybody or a bad thing. But from the 90s onwards, this job became a lot of people getting into, and nearly everybody getting into it, from wrestling schools or wrestling companies going, right, you can be a wrestler, and then training them. That wasn't the case in the 80s. You had to find a wrestler to bring you into the wrestling business, and you had to go through whatever you had to go through.
It was an apprenticeship type situation.
Yes.
Anything, right?
Yes. And so the communication wasn't as much. Now, if you go back and watch those matches, you go, well, if you're used to modern wrestling, there wasn't a lot going on. And then if you're not me, or somebody like me who just understands that, you might go, yeah, but back in my day, we didn't do this, and this. Yeah, well, it's just because that wasn't the case then. Wasn't the way it was then. And if I had met somebody and they were coming up, I would back myself into the ropes and hit them with something. If they weren't getting up, I would do something else. And it became a thing of more communication. So the two things that have changed in life is more communication in wrestling, less communication in real life. People don't communicate anymore, and problems keep happening because they don't communicate when things first happen, and then it gets turned into 10-headed monsters because they go and tell other people, and then nobody actually confronts anybody. Wrestling has gone the other way,
right?
Where you had very little communication, but you all understood. Didn't matter where you were from Europe, from Japan, from Mexico, didn't matter, from South America, anywhere in the world. You understood the way the body moved and the way certain things happened. And so you could have a match with people who didn't speak any English or any whatever the language may be. It has become less and less of that. And it's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way it is. And it makes for sometimes far more exciting wrestling that you can actually, even people who don't speak English nowadays, because there's always somebody there who can translate, not always, but most of the time, you can figure out all kinds of things in wrestling to do far more. Or you can have which is the style that I was trained in, to have a wrestling match with anybody who can't speak. You don't have to speak. You can have a professional quality wrestling match with people who can't speak a word of English, and you do not have to speak a single word to them, knowing as long as they know how to, that, and asking or trying to figure out by I could just get in there and do a certain few things. And I'm not going to give that away on here, to know if this person was well trained or not. And if they weren't, then I would keep it very basic and very simple and just wrestle them and use different body parts and whatever I needed to do. If I could tell that they were, years ago, if I could tell that they'd been well trained, didn't matter what country they came from, and they understood the universe, how the body moves, I could get in there and make it work. Does that make sense?
For sure.
Without me trying to give away every trick. Right. Again, I'm the magic circle here. I don't want to give away all my tricks or what used to happen.
Right.
But it can make for far more nowadays. Really, I think that's why a lot of old wrestlers get the way they're. If you've got the ability to talk to somebody or communicate with somebody, and you can set things up and it still doesn't look as good as the way they thought it should look, what excuse have you got?
No, nothing at all.
Well, you have, because it's just not, it's just a different day and age. I'm not sticking up for anybody. But I can see how people who aren't in this job anymore and don't realize and haven't lived through the changes look at it that way. I don't look at it that way. I just know that the job's changed, and so I change with it. I don't go, oh, back in my day. I just go, okay, the job's changed now. Let's just make it work, which is everything. Everything. Right. How many times have I said that on this show? Let's just make it work.
Right. Right.
Right.
I liken it to playing music. Like, I don't have to speak the same language as somebody to play music with them. You know, like I was in New Orleans. They said, "Oh, you play bass?" I go, "Yeah." "You want to play some songs?" I'm sure. Now I got on stage. They didn't tell me what song they were doing. They didn't tell me what key it was in. But as I was able to play with them, and as I tell my students, the number I got a bass. I have a lot of experience. I have some knowledge. I have some confidence. But really, in music, and I'm guessing this is the same in wrestling. It's mostly listening. It's mostly paying attention. And if you have that ability, like if I see someone is at a higher level than I am, I know to listen. If I know someone's below level, like you said, you pay attention, you see that they're not at that level, and you adjust to that. And it seems very similar to music and wrestling in that way.
But I also was fortunate enough to be from a teenager around people who've been doing this for 20 years and all knew how to do that and teach me how to do that.
You were taught right.
How can you blame anybody for not being there? No, I wasn't taught right. I was taught by the right people.
Wow, that is an interesting distinction. That is.
If you haven't been around those people, how can you possibly know? Unless you are the one. We've said that before. Unless you are just magically talented and naturally good at this.
Right.